Mrs. Eleanor Hayes walked slowly down the sidewalk, holding tightly to Max's harness. The 78-year-old woman couldn't see the world around her, but she didn't need to. She had Max. The loyal German shepherd had been her guide for 8 years, helping her cross streets, climb stairs, and feel safe. The afternoon was peaceful. The sun warmed Eleanor's face, and she could hear birds chirping in the trees. Max walked beside her, his steps steady and sure. He always knew where to go, leading her with gentle confidence. People in the neighborhood often smiled when they saw them. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hayes," a kind voice called. She smiled and nodded, enjoying the familiar sounds of her community. But peace doesn't last forever. A loud noise shattered the calm. A roaring motorcycle engine. Too close, too fast. Eleanor stopped, gripping Max's harness. The smell of burning rubber filled the air. Tires screeched as a motorcycle swerved onto the sidewalk. The rider barely missed them. Max tensed, pulling Eleanor back. She stumbled but stayed on her feet. Her heart pounded. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky. The motorcycle came to a rough stop. The rider, a man reeking of alcohol, grumbled as he kicked his bike stand down. He was angry. At what? No one knew. His leather jacket was torn, and his helmet dangled carelessly from one hand. People on the street watched but stayed silent. Max let out a low growl. He stood protectively in front of Eleanor, his body tense. She could feel it through the harness. "Easy, Max," she whispered, though she didn't know what was happening. The man took a step forward and scowled. "Stupid dog," he muttered. Then, without warning, he lifted his foot and kicked Max hard in the side. A painful yelp filled the air. Max tumbled onto the pavement, his body twisting from the force of the kick. Eleanor felt the leash go slack. A terrible feeling of helplessness washed over her. She couldn't see what had happened, but she heard it. The sound of pain in Max's cry sent a chill through her. Gasps rose from the crowd. A woman covered her mouth in shock. A man clenched his fists, but no one moved. The motorcyclist smirked, his breath heavy with alcohol. "Shouldn't be in my way," he muttered. Eleanor reached out, feeling for Max. "Max," she whispered. Her hands trembled as she crouched down. Her best friend, her protector, had been hurt. Max struggled to his feet, shaking. He whimpered but forced himself to stand. Even in pain, he moved back to Eleanor's side, pressing his nose into her hand. She felt warmth return to her fingers. He was still there, still protecting her. The motorcyclist laughed, turning back toward his bike. "Not so tough now." The crowd was silent. No one knew what to do. Some looked at their phones, but no one stepped forward. Would he really get away with this? But someone did step forward. A voice, young and strong, broke the silence. "Hey, you can't do that." The motorcyclist turned, eyes narrowing. A teenage boy, no older than 16, stood nearby. His hands were in fists, his jaw tight. He wore a hoodie and ripped jeans, looking like trouble himself. But right now, he was standing up for someone else. The boy took a step closer. And that's when everything changed. Jake clenched his fists as he stepped forward. The teenage boy wasn't afraid of much, but seeing the drunk motorcyclist kick the blind woman's dog made his blood boil. He didn't know Mrs. Hayes personally, but he had seen her before. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her, the kind old lady who always smiled and had the most loyal dog by her side. And now, that dog had just been kicked by some heartless guy. The motorcyclist turned and glared at Jake. "Mind your business, kid," he growled. Jake didn't move. His dark eyes burned with anger. "You think you're tough? Kicking an old lady's dog." The crowd remained frozen. People whispered, glancing at each other, but no one else spoke up. A man in a suit checked his phone, pretending not to notice. A woman covered her child's eyes, pulling her away. Even the store owner across the street just watched from his doorway. Cowards. Jake took another step forward. His heart pounded, but he didn't care. Someone had to do something. Eleanor knelt beside Max, running her hands over his fur. She didn't need to see to feel his pain. His breathing was uneven, his body trembling. She knew he was hurt, but how badly? Tears stung her eyes. "Max," she whispered, stroking his ears. "Stay with me, boy." Max let out a soft whimper, but nuzzled against her. Even now, even in pain, he still wanted to protect her. The motorcyclist scoffed. "Stupid dog got in my way." He turned back toward his bike. "I don't have time for this." Jake saw red. "Oh, no, you don't." He grabbed the man's arm before he could reach his bike. The motorcyclist yanked away. "Get off me, kid." Jake didn't back down. "You think you can just kick a dog and walk away?" His voice was sharp, filled with rage. "How about I kick you and see how you like it?" A few people in the crowd murmured. The motorcyclist hesitated. Maybe he had expected no one to care. Maybe he thought people would just let him leave. But now, all eyes were on him. Eleanor lifted her head. "Who's there?" she asked weakly. Jake's voice softened. "It's okay, ma'am. I won't let him get away with this." Eleanor could hear the emotion in his voice. She didn't know this boy, but she could tell he cared. The motorcyclist smirked. "You're just a kid. What are you gonna do?" Jake's fists tightened. He was ready to throw a punch. He wanted to. But then, a deep, low growl filled the air. "Max." The injured dog slowly lifted his head. His body shook, but his golden brown eyes burned with fierce loyalty. His growl was quiet but strong. A warning. Even after being kicked, even in pain, Max refused to let the man hurt Eleanor or anyone else. The motorcyclist's smirk faded. He took a step back. "What's your problem, mutt?" Jake grinned. "His problem? You kicked him, idiot." More whispers ran through the crowd. Someone finally pulled out their phone and started recording. Another person muttered, "We should call the police." The motorcyclist cursed under his breath. He could feel the energy shifting. He wasn't in control anymore. People were waking up. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called the cops. The man's eyes darted around. "I don't need this," he muttered. He turned to grab his bike, but Max let out a sharp bark. It wasn't weak this time. It was powerful. Jake smirked. "Yeah, I don't think you're going anywhere, buddy." The motorcyclist froze. He could run, but where? Too many people were watching. Too many cameras were pointed at him. The police were getting closer. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Max's head. "Good boy," she whispered. Even though she couldn't see what was happening, she could feel that something had changed. Jake folded his arms and stared at the motorcyclist. "Now what?" he taunted. And for the first time since this started, the man looked afraid. The motorcyclist's hands clenched into fists. He looked around, realizing he was trapped. The crowd had grown, and now people were recording. Sirens echoed in the distance, getting closer. His drunken confidence faded. Max stood tall beside Eleanor, his ears perked. He was still in pain, but he wouldn't back down. He had a job, to protect Eleanor. Even after being kicked, he refused to give up. Jake stepped forward, arms crossed. "What's wrong?" "You were real tough a minute ago," he said with a smirk. The motorcyclist glared at him. "You don't scare me, kid." Jake shrugged. "I don't have to." "He does." He pointed at Max. The dog's steady, watchful eyes made the man uneasy. More people in the crowd started speaking up. "You're in big trouble, buddy. You don't just kick a guide dog. The cops are coming." The motorcyclist's eyes darted toward his bike. He took a step back, then turned, ready to run. But Jake was faster. Without thinking, Jake lunged and grabbed the man's jacket. The motorcyclist stumbled but shoved Jake back hard. Jake fell onto the pavement, scraping his elbow. Pain shot through his arm, but he didn't care. He scrambled to his feet, ready to go again. Max barked, loud and sharp. The sound froze everyone. Even the motorcyclist stopped. Max wasn't just barking, he was warning. His golden brown eyes locked onto the man, his body tense. Eleanor, still holding Max's harness, spoke softly. "Max, stay." Max obeyed, but he didn't take his eyes off the man. He wouldn't attack, but he was ready if he had to be. The motorcyclist swallowed hard. His confidence was gone. His body swayed slightly, whether from alcohol or fear, no one could tell. Jake wiped his scraped arm and smirked. "Yeah, I wouldn't try anything if I were you." The sirens grew louder. The crowd parted as a police car pulled up. A tall officer stepped out, looking serious. He scanned the scene. Eleanor kneeling beside Max, the shaken crowd, Jake standing with his fists tight, and the motorcyclist, who now looked very nervous. "What's going on here?" the officer asked. Before anyone else could speak, a woman pointed at the motorcyclist. That man kicked her guide dog. The officer's expression darkened. He turned to Eleanor. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Eleanor nodded. "I'm fine, but my dog." She stroked Max's fur gently. The officer crouched beside her. "Don't worry, ma'am. We'll take care of this." He looked up at the motorcyclist. "Sir, have you been drinking?" The man shifted uncomfortably. "I just had a little." The officer's partner had already opened the car door. "We got a call about reckless driving. You matched the description." The crowd murmured in agreement. "He almost hit her," someone called. The officer stood up. "Sir, turn around. Hands behind your back." The motorcyclist hesitated but saw no way out. He sighed heavily and obeyed. The officer handcuffed him and guided him to the car. "You're under arrest for reckless driving, animal cruelty, and public intoxication." Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Good riddance," he muttered. Max wagged his tail weakly. It was as if he understood. The danger was gone. The officer turned to Jake. "And you, what's your name, kid?" "Jake," he answered, standing tall. The officer gave a small nod. "You did good today, Jake." Jake felt warmth in his chest. He wasn't used to hearing that. The crowd started to disperse, the excitement over, but one thing was clear. Max was a hero. Eleanor reached for Jake's hand, her fingers soft but strong. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Jake looked down at her, surprised. No one had ever really thanked him before. He scratched the back of his head, feeling awkward. Yeah, no problem." Max leaned against Eleanor, his tail wagging a little more. Despite everything, he was still loyal, still strong, still her protector. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a purpose too. The crowd slowly started to break apart, people murmuring as they walked away. The motorcyclist was now in the police car, his head hanging low. Justice had come for him. But Jake wasn't thinking about the man anymore. His eyes were on Max. The German shepherd still stood proudly beside Eleanor, but something was wrong. His tail, usually high and wagging, drooped. His body trembled slightly, and his breathing seemed uneven. Jake frowned. "Hey, I think he's hurt bad." Eleanor's face tightened with worry. She ran her hands over Max's back and sides. He let out a quiet whimper when she touched his ribs. Jake's stomach twisted. He had seen tough dogs before, but Max was different. This wasn't just a pet. This was her guide, her protector, her best friend. A woman in the crowd, who had stayed behind, stepped forward. I work at the vet's office down the street. I can help." Eleanor turned her head toward the voice. "Please," she said softly. The woman knelt beside Max, gently pressing along his ribs. "He's definitely bruised," she murmured. "Maybe a cracked rib. He needs an X-ray to be sure." Eleanor swallowed hard. "He saved me. He always saves me." Jake felt a lump in his throat. This dog had taken a hit for her and still stood tall. The vet worker smiled kindly. "Let me call the clinic. We'll get him checked right away." She pulled out her phone and stepped aside. Jake watched as Eleanor ran her fingers over Max's fur, whispering softly. He wished he had someone who cared about him like that. The police officer who had arrested the motorcyclist walked back over. "Do you need a ride to the vet?" he asked Eleanor. She nodded. "That would be wonderful. Thank you." The officer opened the back door of his patrol car. "I can take you both." Jake hesitated. He wasn't really part of this. He could just walk away now. But something inside him said, "Don't." He cleared his throat. "Ugh, can I come too?" Eleanor smiled gently. "Of course, dear." Jake felt warmth spread in his chest. He climbed into the police car beside her, watching as Max carefully stepped in. Even hurt, the dog moved with quiet strength. He wasn't just any dog. He was a fighter. At the vet's office, the small animal clinic smelled like medicine and clean floors. The moment they arrived, a vet and 2 assistants rushed Max to the back. Jake sat beside Eleanor in the waiting room. He tapped his fingers on his jeans, glancing at her. She sat still, hands folded in her lap. "He'll be okay," Jake said, though he wasn't sure. Eleanor nodded. "Max is strong." Silence stretched between them. Jake wasn't good at waiting. He wanted to do something, but there was nothing to do. Finally, the vet walked out. "Max is going to be okay," she said with a smile. Eleanor let out a breath of relief. Jake felt his shoulders relax. "He has some bruising and a small fracture in his rib, but no serious damage," the vet continued. "With rest and pain medicine, he'll recover fully." Eleanor smiled, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you." Jake grinned. "Told you he was a fighter." The vet chuckled. "That's an understatement." She turned to Jake. "By the way you stood up for him and Eleanor, you did a good thing today." Jake shifted, feeling a little embarrassed. I don't like bullies." Eleanor reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You are a good boy, Jake." No one had ever said that to him before. He swallowed hard, looking at Max, who was now resting peacefully on a soft blanket. Maybe he had done something right for once. The vet's office was quiet except for the soft ticking of a wall clock. Max lay on a blanket, his breathing slow but steady. His golden brown eyes were open, watching Eleanor. Even in pain, he never took his eyes off her. Jake sat nearby, tapping his foot. He hated hospitals, even animal ones. They always made him feel nervous, like something bad was about to happen. But this time, it was different. This time, he wanted to be here. The vet had said Max would recover with rest, but Jake could see that Eleanor was still worried. She needed Max as much as he needed her. Eleanor reached out, feeling for Max's head. Her fingers brushed his ears, and Max let out a soft sigh, relaxing under her touch. "You're a strong boy," she whispered. "You always have been." Jake swallowed. He wasn't good with emotional moments. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. "So, what happens now?" Eleanor turned her head slightly, as if thinking. "Now we take him home," she said softly, "and we help him heal." Jake blinked. "We?" Before he could ask what she meant, the vet returned with a clipboard. "Max is doing well. He'll need rest for a few weeks. No running or jumping. Short walks only. He'll need help, but he should make a full recovery." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you, doctor." Jake frowned. "Wait, what do you mean, help? She lives alone. Who's gonna take care of him?" Eleanor smiled in Jake's direction. "Well, maybe you, if you'd like." Jake's eyes widened. "Me?" Eleanor nodded. "You care about him. I can tell." Jake hesitated. No one had ever asked him for help before. People usually saw him as a troublemaker, the kid who didn't follow rules. But Eleanor, she trusted him. She believed in him. He scratched the back of his head. Yeah, I could help." The vet smiled. "That's a great idea. Max will need someone young and strong to help take him outside. Jake smirked. Well, I am pretty strong. Eleanor chuckled. Yes, I can tell. For the first time, in a long time, Jake felt needed. Going home. The officer who had given them a ride earlier offered to drive them home. Jake carefully lifted Max into the back seat, making sure not to hurt him. The dog wagged his tail slightly, giving Jake a small nudge with his nose. Jake grinned. Yeah, you're welcome, tough guy. The ride home was quiet, but a good kind of quiet. The kind that made Jake feel peaceful. When they arrived, Jake helped Eleanor inside while the officer carried Max. The house was small but cozy, filled with the scent of fresh tea and something sweet, maybe cookies. Jake had never been inside before. He had always seen Eleanor walking outside, but never knew much about her life. You have a nice place, he said, glancing around. Eleanor smiled. Thank you, dear. The officer gently placed Max on a soft dog bed in the living room. He should be comfortable here. Eleanor knelt beside Max, stroking his fur. You're home now, she whispered. Jake watched as Max's tail thumped weakly against the bed. Even hurt, he was happy to be home. The officer stood up. You did a good thing today, Jake. Jake shrugged. Yeah, well, someone had to. Eleanor turned her head toward Jake. You're a brave boy, Jake. He froze. No one had ever called him that before. His throat tightened. He quickly looked away, shoving his hands into his pockets. Yeah, well, Max is the real hero. Eleanor smiled. Yes, but even heroes need good friends. Jake glanced at Max, who was watching him with warm, trusting eyes. Maybe, just maybe, he had found a friend too. The living room was quiet except for the soft breathing of Max, who lay resting on his dog bed. His golden brown eyes were half open, watching Eleanor as she sat nearby. Even in pain, he refused to fully sleep until he knew she was safe. Jake stood awkwardly, not sure what to do next. He had never spent much time inside someone else's house before, especially not someone like Eleanor. Her home felt warm, welcoming, and peaceful, something Jake wasn't used to. Eleanor gently stroked Max's fur. You should get some rest, my brave boy. Max let out a small sigh and closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to relax. Jake cleared his throat. So, what do we do now? Eleanor smiled in Jake's direction. Now, we take care of him. It will take time, but he will heal. Jake glanced at Max. So, he can't go outside much, right? Eleanor nodded. Not for long walks, no, but he will still need fresh air. Jake hesitated. I could help with that, I guess. Eleanor's smile grew. That would be very kind of you, dear. Jake shifted from foot to foot. He wasn't used to people calling him kind. Learning to help. The next morning, Jake showed up early. He knocked on Eleanor's door, hands stuffed into his pockets. Eleanor opened it with a warm smile. Good morning, Jake. He gave a small nod. Morning. How's Max? He's doing better, she said. Come in. Jake stepped inside and saw Max lying in his bed. His ears perked up when he heard Jake's voice, and his tail gave a weak but happy wag. Jake grinned. Hey, tough guy. Eleanor carefully picked up Max's harness and held it out. Would you like to help me take him outside? Jake blinked. Me? I mean, I don't know how to do all that guide dog stuff. Eleanor chuckled. That's all right, dear. Just help him walk slowly. He trusts you. Jake hesitated, then took the harness. He knelt beside Max and gently clipped it on. All right, buddy. Let's take it easy. Max stood slowly, his legs a little shaky. But when Jake held the leash gently, the dog leaned on him for support. Jake swallowed. This dog, who had protected Eleanor with everything he had, was now trusting Jake to protect him. They stepped outside, the morning air crisp and cool. Max moved carefully, his pace slow. Jake walked beside him. making sure not to rush. Eleanor stood at the door, listening. "You're doing great, Jake." Jake smirked. "Yeah, well, I am pretty amazing." Eleanor chuckled. "Yes, you are." A silent understanding. As the days passed, Jake found himself spending more and more time with Max and Eleanor. Every morning, he showed up to help take Max outside. And every time, Max wagged his tail a little more. His strength was returning. One afternoon, as Jake sat on Eleanor's porch, she suddenly spoke. "Jake, do you have family nearby?" Jake hesitated. "Not really." Eleanor nodded, as if she already knew the answer. "Well, I just want you to know, you are always welcome here." Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. He looked at Max, who lay beside him, eyes filled with trust. Maybe, for the first time in his life, he had found a place where he truly belonged. The days passed, and Max slowly started to heal. His bruises faded, his ribs became stronger, and his steps became steadier. But he wasn't the only one changing. Jake was changing too. Every morning, he arrived at Eleanor's house to help with Max. At first, he told himself it was just to help the dog, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. He liked being there. He liked how Eleanor greeted him with a warm smile. He liked how Max wagged his tail as soon as he heard Jake's voice. He liked feeling needed. One morning, as Jake knocked on the door, Eleanor called out, "Come in, dear." Jake stepped inside, rubbing his hands together. "Morning. How's the tough guy doing today?" Max's ears perked up, and his tail thumped against the floor. Jake grinned. Yeah, I know you missed me." Eleanor chuckled. "He really has gotten attached to you, Jake." Jake knelt beside Max and gently patted his side. "Well, I guess he has good taste." Max licked Jake's hand in response, making him laugh. A surprise for Jake. That afternoon, Eleanor sat on the porch with a small wooden box in her lap. Jake was tossing a ball lightly for Max, who was finally strong enough to chase after it. Eleanor smiled. "Jake, can you come here for a moment?" Jake walked over, brushing his hands on his jeans. "Yeah." Eleanor held out the wooden box. "This is for you." Jake blinked in surprise. "For me? Why?" Eleanor's smile was gentle. "Because you have been such a wonderful friend to Max. And to me." Jake hesitated before slowly opening the box. Inside was a leather bracelet with a small silver charm shaped like a dog's paw. Jake swallowed hard. No one had ever given him anything like this before. I don't know what to say," he muttered. Eleanor reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "Just say you'll always remember that you are important, Jake." Jake clenched his jaw and quickly looked away. He didn't want Eleanor to see his eyes getting watery. He cleared his throat. "Yeah, I'll remember." He carefully slipped the bracelet onto his wrist. It fit perfectly. Max nudged his arm, and Jake chuckled. "You like it too, huh?" Eleanor smiled. "It suits you. A new beginning." Later that evening, as Jake prepared to leave, Eleanor called out again, "Jake, wait." He turned around. "Yeah." She stood on her porch, a thoughtful look on her face. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" Jake hesitated. He had never been invited to dinner at someone's house before. He usually ate alone or grabbed something cheap from the store. But Eleanor's house smelled like something warm and home-cooked. And the way she looked at him, like she truly wanted him there, made his chest tighten. Jake shoved his hands into his pockets. Sure, I guess." Eleanor smiled. "Good. I made extra." As Jake stepped inside, Max followed, his tail wagging happily. And for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel like a kid wandering through life alone. He felt like he belonged. The smell of warm food filled Eleanor's small kitchen. Jake sat at the wooden table, feeling a little nervous. He wasn't used to eating dinner with other people. Usually, he ate alone. grabbing whatever he could find. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt special. Eleanor placed a plate in front of him. "Here you go, dear." Jake looked down at the steaming plate of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. A real meal. His stomach growled loudly, and he quickly picked up his fork. Eleanor chuckled. "Eat up, Jake. There's plenty." He didn't need to be told twice. He dug in, savoring every bite. It was the best meal he'd had in a long time. Max lay nearby on his dog bed, chewing on a special bone Eleanor had given him. His tail thumped against the floor as he enjoyed his treat. As they ate, Eleanor spoke gently. "Jake, do you know what I've learned in life?" Jake looked up, chewing his food. "What?" She smiled. "That family is not always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people and animals who love and care for you, no matter what." Jake's fork froze midair. He swallowed hard, her words sinking deep into his heart. He had always thought he was alone, that no one cared, that he had no real place in the world. But sitting here, eating this meal, with Eleanor smiling at him and Max resting beside him, he realized he was wrong. Maybe he did have a family. Maybe this was it, a new purpose. After dinner, Jake helped Eleanor wash the dishes. He wasn't great at it, but Eleanor just laughed when he splashed water everywhere. Max watched them, his golden brown eyes filled with warmth. As Jake dried the last plate, he glanced at Eleanor. "So, what happens now?" Eleanor wiped her hands on a towel. "What do you mean, dear?" Jake shrugged. "I mean, Max is almost healed. You don't really need me around anymore." Eleanor tilted her head. "Jake, is that what you think?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yeah. I was just helping out." Eleanor reached for his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Jake, you're not just a helper. You're family now." Jake's throat tightened. He looked down at his wrist, where the leather bracelet she had given him still sat. He thought about Max, the dog who had risked his life to protect Eleanor, the dog who had slowly come to trust Jake too. Jake knelt down beside Max, running his fingers through the shepherd's soft fur. "What do you think, buddy? Am I part of the pack now?" Max licked Jake's hand in response. Jake laughed. "Yeah, I guess that's a yes." Eleanor smiled warmly. "You will always have a place here, Jake, if you want it." Jake took a deep breath. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel lost. He looked up at Eleanor and nodded. "Yeah, I want that." A bright future. Days turned into weeks, and Jake continued to visit every day. He helped with Max's recovery, took him for walks, and even started fixing small things around Eleanor's house. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, Eleanor suddenly said, "Jake, have you ever thought about working with animals?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Like, as a job?" She nodded. "You have a gift, dear. Max trusts you, and so do I. Maybe you could train to work with dogs one day." Jake blinked, considering her words. He had never thought about his future before. He had never imagined himself doing anything. But now, maybe he could. Maybe this was his chance to do something meaningful. He glanced at Max, who was now back to full strength, sitting beside him like a loyal guardian. Jake grinned. "You think I'd be good at it, tough guy?" Max barked happily, as if to say, "Yes." Eleanor smiled. "I believe in you, Jake." For the first time in his life, Jake believed in himself too.